Hindsight is always 2020, but hindsight bias is real. We're going to talk about that and some of the worst trades in baseball history and see if they can be justified. This is Locked On MLB.
You are Locked On MLB, your daily MLB podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, baseball fans. Welcome to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, which is your team every day. This is the daily podcast. We talk about all of Major League Baseball. I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. As you can tell from the lower third, if you're watching me on YouTube, you can call me Sully. Today's episode is being dropped on the 27th day of December 2021. If you celebrate Christmas, I hope you had a really great one. And thanks so much for making us your first listen, as we're available on all your free podcasts and catchers. If you got a smart device, please be sure to tell it to play podcast Locked On MLB, or check out some of the other great shows on the Locked On Podcast Network, including Locked On Bets with your boy Q and expert analysis from Lee Sterling. Follow us on Twitter and on Instagram at Locked On MLB Pods. I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. I want to talk to you about the concept of what is known as hindsight bias. Now, we see that all the time in sports, that we look at a terrible decision that was made, a bad trade or bad free agent signing that was done, and you look back and say, oh man, how could they have done that? Well, Britannica.com identifies and defines hindsight bias as following. Hindsight bias is the tendency upon learning an outcome of an event, such as an experiment, a sporting event, a military decision, or a political election, to overestimate one's ability to have foreseen the outcome. It's colloquially known as the I knew it all along phenomenon. Now, we see this like crazy. Now, I'm not a big football watcher, but the concept of the Monday morning quarterback should be clear to everyone. It was so obvious what they should have done. What were they thinking? I knew it all along. Well, baseball has so much hindsight bias that we look at, why did they make this move instead of that move? Why did they pull this pitcher instead of that? Why didn't they pinch hit for this person? Why did they sign this person? Why didn't they sign that person? All these different things that we look back on and say, oh, it was so obvious to us. They must have been stupid. We're so much smarter sitting where we are. And the idea of some of these moves happening were just such staggering incompetence that we just look at them and go like, oh my God, they were crazy to do that thing. Well, I think that's all based on hindsight bias. Every time we talk about a bad trade or a bad signing, we are doing it almost entirely from the lens of knowing how it turned out, of knowing the series of events took place afterwards. So therefore we look back and say that was dumb that they did that. And then we say, and we do the same thing for great trades or great signings or great moves. Oh, they pulled this person at the right time. This pitcher came in. Lasorda held out Kirk Gibson at the right moment, and Dennis Eckersley screwed up by pitching that pitch. We all do that in reverse. You know, we all look at it in reverse, and that hindsight bias is real. And the next two episodes, I want to talk to you about some of what are considered to be the biggest blunders in baseball history, and look at them without the hindsight bias and try to figure out, what were they thinking? Could it have been justified? And in some of the cases, the answer is yes. In one very specific case, I had a really hard time doing it. But in today's episode, I took what are considered to be 10 of the absolute worst trades in the history of baseball. Whenever you see these lists of what are the worst trades in baseball history, what are the worst trades in baseball history, inevitably some combination of the trades that I'm about to list will come up. Maybe not all of them. Some lists are a little bit different, but a couple of the ones I'm going to say are on all of them because they're universally accepted as terrible trades. Even in the great film Bull Durham, my personal favorite baseball movie of all time, I did a whole podcast series on that. Check out Bull Durham Minute on your podcast catch if you want to listen to that. In the opening credits of the film, Susan Sarandon talks about bad trades. And she says, who can forget Milt Pappas for Frank Robinson, for crying out loud? And so, yeah, some of these are part of our language. Now, I want to just say that the trades I'm going to be looking at are really, most of them are going to have many, many years of hindsight behind them. We have some recent blunder deals, like the Dodgers trading Yordan Alvarez for Josh Fields, which no doubt will be listed as a really bad deal once we see what Alvarez's career unfolds to. The Pirates dealing, for example, Chris Archer for Austin Meadows, Tyler Glasnow, and Shane Baz is already considered to be a bust, especially since Archer's no longer on the Pirates. But you can look back and say, well, the Pirates are trying to shake the team up with a veteran move. You know, they had never had any problem getting young players on it. They need to do something they thought would give the team a little boost. Why they thought it would be Chris Archer, I'm not 100% sure. You know, we're pretty sure that the Marlins got swindled in the Christian Yelich deal. But let's wait to see if any of them evolve. As you're going to see in some of the moves that we talk about, a lot of times they involve a team coveting a veteran and trading away a minor leaguer, and that minor leaguer blossoming in a way that not a lot of people thought they would. And sometimes our perception of trades change over the years. At the trade deadline in 1997, the Giants acquired 3 veteran pitchers, Wilson Alvarez, Roberto Hernandez, and Danny Darwin. And those 3 pitchers all helped the Giants win the division in the final week of the season. And the White Sox were killed for that trade because the White Sox were still kind of in contention, and they traded away 3 veteran pitchers. At the time, that was considered a horrible trade for the White Sox. When doing some research for this particular podcast episode, that trade was listed as one of the worst trades in baseball, in recent baseball history, but for the Giants, because one of the minor leaguers that they traded away was Keith Folk. Bobby Howry was another minor leaguer. So it's like, oh man, what were the Giants thinking trading away Keith Folk and Bobby Howry? But at the time, it was, what are the White Sox doing trading away all these veterans? You need to have a little bit of distance to be able to make any sort of a real look at some of these deals. You know, the White Sox, by the way, traded for a couple of times. The Expos wound up trading a couple of times for some secure veterans, Mark Langston, who we'll get to, and Bartolo Colon, and it cost them Randy Johnson and Cliff Lee, we'll get to Randy Johnson in a little bit. You know, it's hard to trash when a team acquires a veteran and the minor leaguer, most of the time a minor leaguer gets traded away for a veteran, they don't amount to anything, okay? And once in a while, you'll get something like the Rangers wanting to, making a deal with the Blue Jays. They send a veteran pitcher like Esteban Loaiza to Toronto, and the Rangers get a minor leaguer who turns out to be Michael Young and a mainstay on the team for a long time. You know, sometimes there's a deal that at the time looks like it's beneficial to both teams. At one point, the Astros had a bunch of young outfielders, but they didn't have much catching. The Indians had Sandy Alomar Jr. on the team, and they had some catching, but they needed some depth in their outfield. They made a swap, and the Indians traded Eddie Taubensee, a left-handed hitting catcher, in exchange for Kenny Lofton. It looked like at the time a deal that helped out both teams. It didn't wind up helping both teams because Kenny Lofton became a perennial all-star and Eddie Taubensee flamed out. But you can understand why that deal was made. Now, sometimes you get a 3-way deal that is so complicated and involves so many pieces that you can't really blame the team if one of the little pieces that dangles around and the name's being thrown around as a complete fluke turns into a star. You know, there's a couple of times where some complicated 3-way deals that benefited a couple of the teams, but wound up costing pitchers who threw multiple Cy Young Award seasons. There was one year where the Diamondbacks, the Yankees, and the Tigers had this weird deal, and the Yankees got Curtis Granderson out of the deal, good player, and the Diamondbacks got a pair of pitchers, Edwin Jackson and Ian Kennedy, and Ian Kennedy was a key player when they wound up winning the division in 2011. Fair enough. One of the players, the Tigers were also involved, and they wound up getting a minor leaguer named Max Scherzer. It was another deal where the Padres and the Cardinals were trying to fix things out. Jake Westbrook going here, Ryan Ludwig going there. Looked like it worked out for both teams. It involved the Indians, who managed to get a minor leaguer named Corey Kluber. So, you can't always fault the team, because it made sense for everyone. A minor league was done this way, and just happened to blossom in a way that no one was imagining. When I start talking about some of the trades, the terrible trades I'm going to try to justify, I'm not going to be talking about any salary dumps or trades where they knew that that they just like, okay, this person, and they just know he's going to go. So, yeah, the Expos were fleeced for Pedro Martinez, but they also knew Pedro Martinez was going to go. Mark McGwire was a goner with the A's. He had been there for a long time. He was ready to move out. Everybody knew that. And so, yeah, the Cardinals fleeced him, but they also knew that they were trying to get something. And so there are lots of examples of that. There's also examples, as I said, of a team wanting a veteran, and one of the players they gave up on happened to blossom. The Blue Jays got the reigning Cy Young Award winner from the Mets when they acquired R.A. Dickey. It cost them Noah Syndergaard. But you can understand why they wanted to get the reigning Cy Young Award winner. And, Anthony Rizzo, when he was with the Padres, I guess people thought he was part of the Adrian Gonzalez trade, but I don't think anyone saw a great big future for him in San Diego. And the Padres got a veteran pitcher in Andrew Kashner. They didn't know Rizzo was going to blossom with the Cubs. And sometimes a player can benefit from the change of scenery. Yes, the trade that sent Jake Arrieta from Baltimore to the Cubs turned out to be a disaster for Baltimore, because he became a Cy Young Award winner with the Cubs. But we don't know if the set of circumstances and the coaching and the change of scenery and maybe the change of environment and change of his life maybe was the shakeup that he needed. Maybe he wasn't going to blossom in Baltimore the way he does. It's more, all this is all clear hindsight bias. I'm going to talk about the 10 trades that are almost universally considered to be the worst trades, and ones that we have a certain amount of distance from, and they all involve Hall of Famers. What do you do in trading away a Hall of Famer? But sometimes these teams make a bet, and sometimes that bet comes through, and sometimes it doesn't. And if you're going to make any bets, go to BetOnline, which is the #1 spot for all your sports action this season. Head to the website or mobile device to sign up today and receive a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Just use promo code LOCKEDON to receive your bonus. From basketball, football, NHL, boxing, UFC, right to your favorite Las Vegas casino games, don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on your favorite sports, so don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available. BetOnline is where the game starts. Okay, let's take a look at the 10 trades I'm going to talk about. And I had mentioned, at the top, the trade that was mentioned during the opening credits in Bull Durham. And Frank Robinson was about 30 years old, still a remarkable player for the Cincinnati Reds, and was a player who was an MVP just a few years before, helped them go to the World Series in 1961, be contenders. But the Reds were starting to put together what ultimately became the Big Red Machine, and they could hit. They had a ton of hitting. And Lee May was coming there, Pete Rose was coming there, Tony Perez was starting to emerge on the team. Hitting was not their problem. What they needed was pitching depth on their team in order to contend in the National League. And they took a chance. And they saw that Frank Robinson was soon going to be on the wrong end of 30. Very, very productive. But Milt Pappas was an all-star pitcher. And the Reds traded away Milt Pappas for Milt Pappas, Dick Simpson, and Jack Balchon for Robinson. And the thought process was this: Pappas was an all-star starting pitcher. And the Reds actually had the Orioles had just acquired both Balchon and Simpson just a few days prior. They were acquired from other organizations. Neither one of them ever played a day with the Orioles. But Balchon was an effective reliever, and Dick Simpson was a 22-year-old outfielder. So from the Reds' point of view, they had a bunch of hitting on their team. They had Vada Pinson. They had the players I mentioned before. And they got an outfielder in Simpson who, they knew wasn't going to be Frank Robinson, but they also got a solid starting pitcher and a solid relief pitcher. And they thought to themselves, hey, look we're still going to score runs. Now we've fortified our pitching staff. You can understand why that trade would make sense. Now, it blew up in the Reds' face spectacularly because Frank Robinson went on to win the Triple Crown in 1966, be the MVP, and lead the Baltimore Orioles to the World Series title against the Los Angeles Dodgers, which was the first ever World Series title for that franchise, dating back to when they were the St. Louis Browns. And so, and Pappas, who wound up having a couple of fine seasons, but mainly with the Braves and threw a no-hitter with the Cubs, never had that great moment with the Reds. And Balchon and Simpson were not exactly factors. So, it's fun to fantasize what the big red machine would have been with Frank Robinson still there. And by the way, Frank Robinson won another World Series ring, beating the Reds in 1970. But, you could understand that they thought to themselves, hey, we can hit. We know that. We just can't pitch. And let's figure this out. They just made the wrong deal. Now, not long after the Robinson deal, another team traded away a player who was a future Hall of Famer, and that was Nolan Ryan of the Mets, was traded to the Angels for Jim Ferguson. All right, this is considered to be one of the worst trades in baseball history, especially since Nolan Ryan threw more no-hitters than anyone in history, and the Mets didn't have a no-hitter till 2012, and frankly, that shouldn't have been a no-hitter because we saw that a ball that was called foul was actually fair, but we won't get into that. You could have Nolan Ryan spent his entire prime with the Mets, and they traded him for Jim Ferguson. By the way, they also traded away a couple of other players. The Mets traded away Leroy Stanton, who had a couple of years as a starting outfielder and had one very good season with the Mariners later in his career, for Jim Ferguson. Why would they do this? Well, because at the time, Nolan Ryan wasn't Nolan Ryan yet. He was this young pitcher who was a key factor in the bullpen in 1969 when they won the World Series. He got the save in one of the World Series games. But he was not yet the dominant Hall of Fame pitcher that he was. He was a guy who was starting to harness his talent, was a strikeout pitcher who was way too wild. And the Mets did have a lot of pitching on that team. But they had some gigantic holes in their infield. And Jim Ferguson had been an all-star 6 of the previous 8 seasons and was one of the biggest stars on the Angels. And so from the Mets' point of view, they thought, look, we know we can pitch, but we're trying to fortify this infield. And we just added an all-star. They didn't realize they were going to add a legend who would continue being a World Series, all-star pitcher deep into the 80s and into the 90s, when Jim Ferguson had long been retired and became a veteran manager at that point. But the thought process was, this guy's a talented pitcher, but how do we know he's going to get it all together? We can get an all-star infielder. Now, a few years after that, another legendary Hall of Fame pitcher was dealt away by the Mets, and it was the darkest day in the history of that franchise. It rocked the New York Mets franchise. Tom Seaver, the franchise, was dealt away in the middle of the 1977 season. It was a psychological blow to the Mets that reverberated for generations. He was the single most popular Met, one of the single most popular players of any New York team in history. He's nicknamed the franchise. Still the most beloved Met of all time. Pitched the Mets to a World Series title that meant a lot more so than just a normal World Series title, because it was the happy ending for Giant and Dodger fans who had their teams taken away from them in the 1950s, that they had a new team to root for, a lousy team, but then they suddenly won and they got to have a winner again. And it was Tom Seaver who helped heal those wounds and move on to a new decade, and was the best pitcher in baseball for his generation. And year in and year out was either the Cy Young Award winner or damn close to it. So why would they do this deal? Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, it became clear that he was clashing with ownership. And ownership was looking around at the terrain and saw free agency was looming. Hell, the entire A's team that just a couple of years ago won 3 straight World Series, including one against the Mets, had been totally dismantled because of free agency. And they knew that if they couldn't sign Seaver to a long-term deal, that they were probably going to lose him and get nothing in return. And so they put together a deal that was, I think, not a salary dump. The Mets stunk in 1977 with Tom Seaver. So what do? They struck a deal with the defending World Series champion, the back-to-back World Series champion, the most powerful team of the 1970s. Did they get chumps from them? No, actually. They got the National League Rookie of the Year in Pat Zachary. And they had the mindset of, hey, let's put together a team and add some depth. Let's have a starting pitcher we can build a staff around. Pat Zachary's the Rookie of the Year. Maybe we can build a staff around him. And then they got a bunch of players who just could not break the Reds' starting lineup. Reds had a starting lineup of Dan Dreesen, Joe Morgan, Dave Concepcion, Pete Rose, Johnny Bench, George Foster, Cesar Geronimo, and Ken Griffey Jr. Good luck getting at-bats in that lineup. But maybe Doug Flynn, who filled in for some injured players during the 76 World Series run, was a capable infielder and may take the best advantage of his chance to be a starting player. Same thing that could be said for Dan Norman and Steve Henderson, who had no shot to play with the Reds. But now these young, talented players who were in their 20s had room to flourish and shine and had no all-stars in their way. So in a way, they could say, yeah, not only did we not lose Tom Seaver and get nothing in return, but we got a pitcher that we can build around and 3 pieces that we can put the team together. And maybe not 4 great players, but sometimes you get 4 good players in exchange for 1 great player. That's how you start building some depth. It didn't happen. Zachary flamed out. Norman was ineffective. Doug Flynn was essentially a utility infielder. Steve Henderson was not much of a player. And Tom Seaver continued to put together Cy Young season year after year and threw a no-hitter with the Reds. Ultimately, Seaver came back for 1 year with the Mets before being swiped away by the White Sox, finished his career with the Red Sox before having 1 more chance with the Mets, but it didn't work out in '87. But yeah, that was their mindset. Not saying they were right. I'm saying that's what they were thinking. They got something back from him. It's just not the way, it didn't turn out the way they thought it would. But hindsight bias is what makes us call that a terrible move. If Pat Zachary turned into an effective starting pitcher and Flynn and Norman and Henderson all became starters on the team, even if Seaver went on to have the wonderful career he had with Cincinnati, you could at least say, hey, look at the Mets at least got some depth from him. They got something. Instead, they got nothing. They probably could have used something to give them a little boost, like a Built Bar. You know, Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar out there. And let me tell you something, this Christmas season, holiday season, oh, I've been loving me my Built Bars because they're the best of both worlds. They're amazingly low in calories and sugar and net carbs and fat, but they're high in protein. And they got so many flavors. You could have a hard time choosing whether it's going to be mint brownie, cherry, double chocolate, cookies, cream, peanut butter brownie, orange, or my personal favorite, which is raspberry. Now, let me tell you something. These are so great. I've been dipping them in my cocoa, and oh, they just melt. It's fantastic. And if you want to have that marshmallow treat for the holidays, guess what? You get your hands on Built Bar Puffs. They're light, they're fluffy, they're marshmallow through and through. Different flavors, all covered in chocolate. They taste so good, you won't believe they're filled with protein. Go to Built.com, use promo code LOCK15, get 15% off your order. Go to Built.com and use promo code LOCK15 for 15% off your order of Built Bars. Going through bad trades of baseball history and trying to find the hindsight bias that we have, there are three that I'm going to lump together because I've seen these lumped together in some of the all-time worst baseball trade moves. And I think all three of these trades can be justified. John Smoltz to the Braves in 1987, Randy Johnson to the Mariners in 1989, Jeff Bagwell to the Astros in 1990. Let's break them down. The Tigers in 1987 were running tooth and nail in an airtight American League East race. And it looked like the Yankees and the Brewers were going to be contenders for a while, but then they fell out. The Tigers were making a run against the incredibly talented Toronto Blue Jays. The Tigers traded for Doyle Alexander, who was a good pitcher for the Atlanta Braves, but they need to have pitching depth. Doyle Alexander just exploded with the Tigers. He pitched 11 games. His record was 9-0. His ERA was microscopic, and he became a workhorse, along with the Jack Morrises and the Frank Tananas and the Dan Petries and the Walt Terrells of that staff. Suddenly, the Tigers had the best starting staff in the American League, and they made a huge run. And Doyle Alexander won some gigantic games, pitching deep into extra innings in a couple of cases against the Toronto Blue Jays in a season where they won the American League East on the final day of the season. And they needed every win to get there. And Doyle Alexander was a huge reason why they were able to overtake a team, the Toronto Blue Jays, which at least on paper and in theory were superior to Detroit. There is no way in heaven or on earth that the Detroit Tigers would have won the American League East in 1987 had they not made that deal. They went into the postseason with the best record in baseball. And the other three teams they had to potentially face in the postseason were an extraordinarily flawed and thin Minnesota Twins team that only made the postseason because the West was so thin that year, a banged up and injured St. Louis Cardinals team, and a Giants team that was kind of cobbled together at the last minute. The Detroit Tigers went into that postseason as overwhelming favorites to win the World Series. And a big reason they got there was because of Doyle Alexander, what he meant down the stretch. Now, as it turned out, those Twins beat Doyle Alexander twice in the American League Championship Series, and they wound up winning it in Detroit. The Twins went to the World Series, faced a completely depleted Cardinals team, and won one of the strangest World Series ever played. And the minor leaguer that the Tigers gave up on was John Smoltz. But if a couple of things went a little differently, Tigers could have won the World Series that year easily. First of all, had they had home field advantage, which they didn't, even though they had the best record in baseball. And they don't win that division without him. That's why they made the trade. The trade was considered a gigantic success when it came out. And Doyle Alexander was an all-star in 1988, the next year with the Tigers, a year where they missed winning the division by a single game. At the time, it looked like a steal for the Tigers. Now, it cost them a Hall of Famer, but it's very easy to see why that deal was made. Of course, the Randy Johnson trade in 1989 has been vilified and put up as one of the what ifs. What if the Montreal Expos were able to keep Randy Johnson? Would he have saved baseball in Montreal? And I saw one article where they said he was traded for a bunch of nobodies. No, that's not what happened at all. Mark Langston was the single most coveted trade chip in all of baseball. There was talk of the Red Sox trading Wade Boggs for Mark Langston. There was talk of the Mets putting together a deal, basically the deal that wound up netting him Frank Viola. But they were eager to get Mark Langston, a strikeout artist with the Seattle Mariners, who everyone knew was going to leave via free agency, and the team that could get him was getting an ace that could lead him to the postseason. Now, the Expos, as it turned out, wanted to go for it. They were in first place for a big chunk of 1989. And they were putting together a team that they knew wasn't built for the long term, but they knew they were playing a vulnerable Mets team, a depleted Cardinals team, an irrelevant Phillies team, and a Cubs team that was hanging around. And the Expos put into their rotation the most coveted pitcher on the market. And suddenly, the Expos shot into first place and looked like, oh my God, this team could go far. And Langston, his first few months with the Expos, was outstanding. And it looked like, oh my God, it just cost the Expos 3 pitchers, one whom was this strange 6'10" dude with control issues. And they netted Mark Langston. Now, as it turned out, the Expos ran out of gas and they finished the season at 500. And the Cubs wound up overtaking them, winning the division, losing the NLCS to San Francisco. It's very easy to look back and say, well, they acquired him, but they finished 500, and it cost them Randy Johnson. But the trade, when the trade was made, it looked like a gigantic success for the Montreal Expos. Yeah. Langston left for the Angels. Yeah. Randy Johnson turned into Randy Johnson. Nobody knew he was going to become Randy Johnson, Hall of Famer at the time. He was this enigmatic figure, wild pitcher who they thought may be great, may not be. We know Mark Langston's great, and we have a chance to win now. It just didn't happen. But that's why they gave it a shot. Jeff Bagwell, this is always considered, this is the short list of worst trades of all time. The Red Sox trading Jeff Bagwell, a local kid, future Hall of Famer, for Larry Anderson, middle reliever, who was gone by the end of the season. Only played about a month and a half in Boston. All right, but let's break that one down too. At the time, Jeff Bagwell was a skinny kid in the minor leagues, not considered to be one of their best power threats. And in terms of either at third base, they had Wade Boggs. And ahead of him in the depth chart in the minor leagues was Scott Cooper. And ahead of him in the first base depth chart was Mo Vaughn. Yes, it's fun to fantasize Mo Vaughn and Jeff Bagwell in the same lineup. But anyone looking at that bunch, Bagwell was number 3 and not the big power threat. Kind of skinny, not a lot of power. Excuse me. And as it turns out, the Red Sox needed bullpen depth in 1990, big time. As it turned out, they had Jeff Reardon as their closer. They didn't have a lot to help set him up. And so they looked at their number 3 on the depth chart, first baseman, and got a veteran middle reliever who actually pitched well for them down the stretch, gave them the middle relief they needed, and like the Tigers in 1987, the Red Sox won the division on the final day of the season. And it's difficult to say whether or not they would have had not had the bullpen depth that they had. Maybe a game here or a game there. The Blue Jays win that division. They have a 1-game playoff to play. But they got themselves into the postseason. Now, they wound up getting thumped by Oakland. And yes, Larry Anderson lost one of the games out of the bullpen. But the A's wound up getting swept by the Reds. What if the Red Sox got into the playoffs and suddenly they're the ones who upset the A's and not the Reds? And all of a sudden we're talking about the 1990 Red Sox as the one that broke the curse and all that other stuff. What if the bullpen depth they had down the stretch, where a run here or a run there is the difference between whether or not they made the postseason or not? They won that final game of the season with a sliding Tom Bernansky catch on the bottom of the ninth, or top of the ninth with 2 outs in a 1-run game. A little bloop here, a little bloop there. There's either a 1-game playoff or they missed the playoffs altogether. I'm not saying it worked out, but I'm saying that's why they did it. Now, let's go through the final couple of trades here. Steve Cralton being traded from the Cardinals to the Phillies is always listed as a terrible one. But at the time, Steve Cralton was a few years older than Rick Wise. He was, Steve Cralton was an all-star with the Cardinals, but Rick Wise was an all-star with the Phillies. And Rick Wise was a little bit younger. Rick Wise was right-handed, Cralton was left-handed, and it was just a swap of two All-Stars. And mind you, Rick Wise made the All-Star team as a Cardinal. It just so happened that Cralton went on to become one of the great pitchers in baseball history and pitched the Philadelphia Phillies to a World Series title. And Cralton checked off every potential box you would ever want to have for a legendary pitcher, which you can't say for Rick Wise. But it wasn't like they thought they were being fleeced. Two All-Stars got swapped. One All-Star became a legend. The other became a solid pitcher. That's why that happened. If Rick Wise became the legend, then that would have, if they both became legends, then it would have been a perfect trade. Now, these last couple trades are going to be a little hard to swallow. Lou Brock, this is always thrown up as one of the worst trades in baseball history. It's tough for Cub fans to swallow a deal that instantly paid off for the rival Cardinals, as right after the Cardinals made this deal, they went on to win the 1964 World Series, a pennant they won on the final weekend of the season. But at the time, it could be justified. The Cubs were fiddling around 500, and they needed pitching to compete in a pitching top-heavy National League. They had outfielders, including Hall of Famer Billy Williams. They had Dick Ellsworth, who was their best pitcher, but he was having a slightly off year. Larry Jackson was an okay pitcher, but it wasn't enough to compete. And just a few years early, Ernie Broglio of the Cardinals finished third in the Cy Young vote. Just the season before, he was an 18-game winner and an all-star caliber pitcher. And the Cubs were getting a workhorse for the rotation who was only 28 years old. They also got Bobby Shantz, who was a former AL MVP, who had evolved into a very good relief pitcher. And certainly better than any relievers the Cubs had. So they were getting a workhorse pitcher and a solid reliever. And they also threw in an outfielder to take Brock's spot in the lineup. So in their eyes, they're dealing Brock for pitching depth. As it happened, Broglio flamed out. Shantz didn't finish the season with the Cubs, and Lou Brock became a Hall of Famer and the greatest stolen base artist of his generation. But that's why they did it. It made sense to them at the time. If they got the pitching depth for that, it would have worked out great. That did not work out for the Cubs. One that did work out for the Cubs was a strange deal in 1981. The Cubs had Ivan DeJesus. Had Ivan DeJesus as their shortstop. The Phillies had Larry Bowa. Ivan DeJesus was a good player who had a down season in 1981. Larry Bowa was a good hitter, but was 5 or 6 years older than Ivan DeJesus. And the Phillies thought, hey, we're buying, we're doing the whole, we're buying high, selling low, all this certain stuff, trading Bowa for DeJesus, saying he's younger. If he improves just a little bit, we've improved our shortstop situation for the next few years. As it happened, to make that work, the Cubs asked him to throw in an infielder. The infielder they threw in was Ryne Sandberg. And you must remember at this point, do not look at the hindsight bias here. At the time, Ryne Sandberg was a third baseman. The Phillies had Mike Schmidt, arguably the greatest third baseman in baseball history, and the reigning, or was he the reigning MVP? I believe he was the reigning MVP. Certainly was going to go on to win a couple more MVPs. And Ryne Sandberg had no chance of breaking the Phillies lineup. So in order to improve their shortstop situation, they would sacrifice a player who wasn't going to play for them anyway. As it turned out, the Cubs moved him to second base. He became one of the greatest second basemen, if not the greatest second baseman in baseball history. Won the National League MVP in 1984 and led the Cubs to 2 postseason appearances, which at the time was unheard of. But that's why it was done. The Phillies made their shortstop position younger. Ivan DeJesus was the starting shortstop in the 1983 World Series for the Phillies. They got a younger shortstop out of it. Sandberg's not even going to play for us. If that's the difference between that and improving the situation, it's the cost of doing business. Uh-oh. And there's the last one. And man, You know, you can't talk about bad trades without Babe Ruth. And Ruth was sold, no players exchanged, contracts sold from the Red Sox to the Yankees. You know the story. Everyone knows the story. The deal that loomed over the Red Sox for 86 years and looked upon as the single shortest sighted deal of all time. And yeah, it didn't turn out well for the Red Sox. It didn't. And at the time, he was an elite pitcher as well as the home run king. I mean, it just, and the legend was he used the money to finance the play No No Nanette. That's not completely true. He did use the money to finance, Harry Frazee, the owner of the Red Sox, did finance several Broadway plays, which he was much more interested in Broadway than he was in the Red Sox. And he did finance No No Nanette in 1925. But it wasn't with the money that he got for Babe Ruth. But yeah, when you read about the deal, most of the stuff that you see is extraordinarily negative against the Red Sox. People wanted to hang Harry Frazee in effigy. Everyone knew it was kind of a bad deal, but there were people who said, hey, look it, Babe Ruth is more trouble than he's worth. He was constantly clashing with the team. He was considered to be an immature hothead. He had sometimes trouble getting drunk and clashing with the other teams. And it was just there were some articles that were written that said, like, in the long run, the Red Sox made the right move. That a guy who, yes, could pitch and hit better than anybody, but is out of control. And eventually that was going to catch up with him. And so he's now the Yankees' problem. And there was a period of time in 1925, after he had turned the Yankees franchise around and won a World Series in 1923, that it looked like some of those articles were pressing, that he was so out of shape and so drunk, and that he basically drunk himself out of the 1925 season. He only played half the year, and it was catching up with him. And there were some people who thought he's washed up. Right around the time No No Nanette came out. As it turned out, Babe Ruth looked in a couple of mirrors and said, I think I'm going to improve myself, and it's safe to say he did. But at the time, he was looked upon as a bit of a hothead, a bit unpredictable, and maybe not worth the trouble. It didn't turn out to be the case, but that is hindsight bias. And this is this episode of Locked On MLB. Thanks so much for making us your first listen, as we're available on all your free podcasting platforms. And check out some of the other great shows in the Locked On Podcast Network, including Locked On Bets with your boy Q and expert analysis from Lee Sterling. Follow us at Locked On MLB Pod. Same handle for Instagram. I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. Talk about the concept of confirmation bias and seeing why some of the worst trades in baseball history ever took place. This has been Locked On MLB for the 27th day of December 2021. I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully.